Welcome back, friends. Last time we walked through the tense and bloody years of the Korean War, a conflict that ended not with victory, but with a very stalemate. It was a reminder that even as America's soldiers fought for freedom abroad, the Cold War was only just beginning to define the decades ahead. But at home, the story felt very different. The guns fell silent in Korea, and millions of American families turned inward. Soldiers came home, factories shifted gears, and the nation looked to the future with a fresh energy. Optimism was in the air. Consumer confidence soared, suburbs began to spread, and a whole new generation was about to arrive. This is the 1950s, the years of the baby boom and suburban America. A time when the country seemed full of promise, prosperity, and comfort, even as under the surface, not everyone was included in that vision. The end of the war wasn't just a relief, it opened the door to the good old consumerism again. Factories that had built tanks, planes, and munitions shut down or retooled overnight, and assembly lines began churning out refrigerators, washing machines, and radios. That shift from wartime production to consumer goods fueled a booming middle class whose buying power was never been stronger. With incomes rising and jobs plentiful, Americans had cash to spend and a culture eager to encourage that spending. Credit expanded quickly, moving from installment plans into the early forms of credit cards. By the early 1950s, installment credit was common. By decade's end, revolving credit was making its way in. Suddenly, households had the means to buy what they wanted now and pay later. What consumers could buy became a symbol not just of comfort but of an ideology. Suddenly, what filled American homes became a silent weapon in the Cold War. That's how we get into the kitchen debate of 1959, where Nixon and Khrushchev squared off inside a model suburban kitchen at the American National Exhibition in Moscow. Nixon showed off dishwashers, toaster ovens, and hi fi systems, arguing that capitalism delivered abundance and choice. Khrushchev fired back, questioning whether such consumer comfort was better than the Soviet promise of equality. Meanwhile, advertising transformed into a powerful force. With television booming, appearing in more than 40% of American households by the mid 50s, manufacturers found a new way to reach consumers. Commercials interrupted the shows like I Love Lucy, celebrity endorsements became common, and jingles stuck in people's head. The message, you are what you buy, and buying signified post war success. Cars became more than vehicles, they became symbol of freedom and pride. The automobile industry surged. Between 1945 and 1960, car ownership exploded. Fueled by rising affluence and new multi lane interstates, drive ins and motels rose alongside highways. A car wasn't just a mode of transport, it was a ticket to go where you want, when you want, and live the suburban dream. All of this painted a picture of abundance that looked like American dream. White picket fences, kitchen appliances within reach, highways to go everywhere, and stores full of gadgets you couldn't imagine living without. But remember, this boom wasn't universal. Many families, especially African American, Latino, indigenous, and poor rural households, were left out of the prosperity or excluded by discriminatory policies. We will come back to all these things very soon. Although we spoke about GI Bill earlier, close to the end of World War, it makes sense to reiterate it here. The GI Bill changed everyday life. Passed in 1944, it helped veterans pay for colleges, start business, and crucially buy homes. By the time the first version of the bill wound down in the mid of 1950s, millions had used it. Education and training benefits alone paid out about 14.5 billion US dollars. And by 1955, lenders had issued roughly 4.3 million veteran affairs backed home loans worth about $33 billion. dollars. In short, the bill didn't just reward service, it built a middle class. Those homes helped fuel the move of the suburbs. Think rows of new houses, tidy lawns, and a car in the driveway. VA rules evolved to make the mortgages longer and payments smaller, which pulled ownership within the reach of many families. Access was far from equal though. In practice, FHA and VA lending often followed private redlining maps, steering money away from black neighborhoods and shutting many black veterans out of the same opportunities their white peers enjoyed. That meant the GI Bill's promise landed unevenly, even as it reshaped the housing market nationwide. Then came the baby boom. Starting in 1946, birth numbers jumped up nearly 20% from 1945 and kept climbing through the 1950s, peaking at about 4.3 million births in 1957. Demographers usually bookend the boom from 1946 to 1964. Those babies would grow into the giant generation that would swell classrooms in the 50s, campuses in the 60s, and the workforce after that. And nowadays, as a meme, youngsters call this generation the boomer uncles or boomer generation. Schools scrambled to keep up. Districts added classrooms, ran double sessions, and hired teachers as enrollments surged. By the fall of 1959, public school rolls reached about 35.3 million students. The post war promise, steady jobs, a home, and a growing family wasn't just a mood. You could count it in bricks, desks, and lunch lines. Levittown became the poster child of post war suburbia. Rows of quick built houses, tidy lawns, and low monthly payments that a GI's paycheck could handle. It also came with a catch. Levittown used whites only deed restrictions, and sale agents simply turned black families away. That wasn't just a private choice, it lined up with federal mortgage rules of the era. The federal government helped make this world. The FHA's 1938 underwriting manual warned lenders about the infiltration of inharmonious racial groups and encouraged developers to use restrictive covenants, legal promises that homes could be occupied only by designated race. Banks and builders followed the guidance because it unlocked FHA insurance and safer loans. Even after many courts made such covenants unenforceable, the habits and maps they created kept shaping who got mortgages and where. Those maps weren't a secret. In the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation drew residential security maps that labeled neighborhoods from best green to hazardous red. Black and immigrant areas were almost always outlined in red, and lenders treated them as high risk. The University of Richmond's Mapping Inequality project has put those red line maps online. You can still trace how they fed unequal investment for decades. Add highways to the mix, and the move to the suburbs sped up. Eisenhower's 1956 Interstate Highway Act knit the country together, slashing commute times and making new subdivisions far from city centers feel practical. At the same time, many routes cut through the established urban neighborhoods, helping push middle class families outward and draining city tax bases. That pattern, growth at the edge, decline in the core, became a hallmark of that era. Who moved first? Researchers show that many white city dwellers left as black families arrived from the south, a shift driven less by falling prices than by race and school lines. Economists have tracked how these migrations reshaped metro maps, strengthening the stark city suburb divide we still see. Popular shorthand calls it white flight, but underneath were policies and incentives that paved the way. While suburbs grew, the countryside changed too. Farming consolidated fast after 1950s. Fewer farms, larger operations, more machines, and specialized crops and livestock. USDA data show farm numbers plunging from mid-century peaks as productivity rose. By the late 20th century, a smaller share of the big farms produced most of the food. That agribusiness turn meant fewer smallholders and more industrial methods. Another quiet migration from many family farms to fewer larger ones. If you picture a 1950s TV living room, cars in the driveway, a new fridge humming in the kitchen, that dream was real for millions. But the map beneath it was drawn by policy. Federally backed suburbs like Levittown, mortgages steered away from the black neighborhoods, highways that favored the edge over the core, and a farm belt built for scale. The prosperity was broad, but it wasn't even. Television moved in like a new neighbor and never left. In 1950, only a sliver of homes had TV sets. A decade later, most did. Factories had once built bombers, were now shipping consoles, and families gathered each evening around the glow of comedy, news, and those catchy jingles that made kids beg for breakfast cereals. Few shows stitched the country together, like I Love Lucy. Shot with a three camera setup in front of a live audience, it felt immediate and shared millions laughing at the same gag in the same week. That technique became the sitcom standard and helped create a truly national pop culture. Music turned the volume up on the generation change. In one electrifying night in 1956, Elvis walked into the Ed Sullivan Show and 60 million viewers, about 83% of everyone watching TV, saw something fresh, loud, and a little dangerous. Parents clutched pearls, teens swooned. Rock and roll was no longer regional, it was prime time. But Elvis wasn't inventing from scratch. Chuck Berry's Maybelline fused country licks with R&B and pushed the guitar to the front of the stage, a blueprint countless bands would copy. Little Richard's Tutti Frutti felt like a rocket blasting off, wild vocals, pounding piano, and pure motion. So seismic that archivists later called it a cannon shot that announced a new age. If TV made America watch together, the transistor radio let teenagers listen apart. Small enough to slip into a pocket, it turned music into a private world on the bus, at the beach, away from parents' ears. That helped fuel a new market. By some estimates, teens were buying the great majority of singles by the late 1950s, and advertisers noticed. Youth culture wasn't just a phrase, it was a business plan. Between TV's shared living room moments and rock's rebellious charge, a generation gap opened. Teens had their own stars, styles, slang, and spending power. Parents still ran the household, but the culture was starting to orbit the kids. The tension, conformity versus independence, will power the stories ahead. The boom of the 1950s looked golden from a distance, but if you walked the hills of eastern Kentucky or West Virginia, you saw a different America. Coal towns shrank, jobs were scarce, and families scraped by in hollows cut off from new highways and new money. By 1960, Appalachia's poverty rate hovered around 31%, far higher than the national average, a hard truth that had been building through the late 50s even as suburbs blossomed elsewhere. Head south and the picture changed again, but not for the better. Jim Crow still ruled daily life of black Americans. Wages lagged, schools were unequal, and intimidation kept many from the ballot box. Those pressures helped push a second wave of great migration as black families left the South for cities in the North and West in search of safety and work. The fight for dignity was already stirring. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 challenged segregated schools. The murder of Emmett Till in 1955 shocked the nation. And that winter's Montgomery bus boycott proved that organized nonviolent protest could move mountains. Out in the fields, another America labored in the shadows. The Bracero program brought millions of Mexican guest workers to US farms between 1942 and 64. They picked the fruits, vegetables, and fed booming cities, often for low pay and with poor housing. When TV journalist Edward R. Murrow aired The Harvest of Shame, viewers saw the faces of migrant workers, American and immigrant, who followed the harvest and still went hungry. This was in 1960. The country of full refrigerators was also a country where the people who filled them couldn't always fill their own plates. At home, the message to many women was simple: the war is over, return to the kitchen. Magazines and TV sold the ideal of the cheerful suburban housewife, even as more married women quietly went back to work. In 1950, roughly 1 in 3 women was in labor force. The number would climb each decade. The tension between the glossy ideal and daily reality helped plant seeds for a new feminist wave. A few years later, Betty Friedan would give that uneasy feeling a name, the problem that has no name, and a generation would recognize itself. So, the 1950s were both storylines at once: stainless steel kitchens and steady paychecks for many, and at the same time, redlined neighborhoods, segregated classrooms, worn out hands in the fields, and women wondering why comfort didn't feel like fulfillment. Those quiet struggles poverty in the hills, protest in the streets, whispers at the kitchen table were about to reshape the country. The 1950s felt like a fresh start. Paychecks were steadier, factories turned out cars and kitchens. And that's where I am wrapping up this episode. Thanks for riding through the 50s with me. An age that looked shiny on the surface but cracked underneath. If you are enjoying this show, please follow on your podcast app, leave a quick rating or review, and share it with a friend or your family WhatsApp group. It really helps this project grow. Next time, we shift from suburbia to the streets as the civil rights movement steps into spotlight. Brown v. Board, Montgomery, sit-ins, and new moral language for America. Until then, thanks for listening. I am Santosh Janardhan signing off.